Alright guys, I recently had an interview where I was asked a question related to CSS and JavaScript, and a friend of mine asked me to share the solution with him, and so I thought that I would go ahead and make a video demonstrating my solution. So essentially, the problem or the question was, how would you make a like a div slide onto the page when not being seen, and then being able to exit out of it and make it slide back. And personally, I prefer to not reach for a library like jQuery if possible, because that's just a lot to bring in if you don't need a ton of code. So this is definitely achievable without much JavaScript. So I'm going to take the time to kind of show you guys kind of an example of what that would look like. So I've got my HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files linked up here. So let me go ahead and get started and show you what that's going to look like. So create a few divs here. We're going to go, let's see, we'll call this the main div. And inside of that, we give ourselves lots of space here. I'm going to call this the left div and the right div. And then outside of that, we're going to call this the slide div. All right. So let's just get a little bit of CSS going here so we can kind of see what we're working with. So all three of these divs are going to have a width of 50% and a minimum height of 100 VH, so that they take up the full height of the screen. Okay, and then the left div, let's give that a background color of, we'll say, light gray. And the right div, we'll go with a background color of just gray. And let's say the slide div will have a background color of black. All right, cool. And then, yeah, let's just see what that looks like right now. Yeah, so cool. Okay, so that's about what I expected. We've got these three divs stacked on top of each other. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this body margin that we have going on. All right, cool. So now we want to get this left div and this right div stacked next to each other. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this left div, and I could do this with Flexbox, but I don't think we need to bring something like Flexbox into this when it's a really quick solution of just floating this left. And that should take care of that. And what's going on here? Yeah, so a right div has a width of 50%. You know what? I think we need to float this one left as well. Yep, there you go. Okay, cool. So now we've got both of these divs here. And then our slide div, what we want to do with that is we want to give that a position of, you could do fixed or absolute. I'm going to go ahead and give it a position of fixed for something that we're going to do with that a little bit later. So, and we're going to, just to kind of show you what you can do with that, we're going to give it left of 80%. It's going to look a little weird. We're going to see just a little bit of it. So go ahead and refresh. There's that slide div right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to 100%. And what that does is it takes the left margin, essentially the left margin, it's not actually margin, but it's the position from the left, it moves it over 100%, which will take it all the way off the screen, and thus not being able to see it when I refresh. Now it's gone. Okay, so it's actually right over here, you just barely can't see it. Alright, so now we've got kind of our basic setup going on here. Alright, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a button inside of our right div. So a button, that's just going to say, we'll say click me. Alright, so that should be showing up. Cool. Okay, let's go ahead and give all of these a padding, all three of these padding. Let's say 30 pixels. Okay, cool. And so you might be wondering why this happened, why all of a sudden I added padding and then that threw off these divs. These are no longer 50%. That's because of a property, CSS property called box sizing. So I can just add that on, and I'm going to give the box sizing property a value of border box, and what that's going to do is it's going to encompass the padding and the border of the element and include that in the dimensions of the element. So now when I refresh, I'm good. Alright, very cool. So now we need to add some JavaScript so that whenever we click this button, right now if I click the button, nothing happens at all. Okay, so what we want to have happen is we want that that hidden div to slide onto the page whenever we click the button. So first thing I need to do, again I'm going to do this without jQuery. With jQuery it would be something just like slide toggle, it'd be pretty easy, but again you're bringing in a whole library just to do one thing, which isn't really necessary. So what we're going to do first is we've got to go and grab the button. I don't have an ID or a class on it. Likely I would put an ID on this button if this were a full-blown website, because odds are there's going to be more than one button on the website, but for the sake of this demo I'm going to do it without an ID. So I'm just going to say let slide button equal document dot query selector, and then we're going to go button. And then I also need to grab the div that's going to slide onto the page, and so that I will grab by its class name. And so we're going to say let slide div equal document dot query selector with the class of slide. Alright, cool. That could have just as easily been an ID instead of a class. I like to use classes a lot, but IDs would work fine there since this is the only instance of using it. So, alright, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to put an event listener on this slide button. And so we're going to say slide button dot add event listener. That takes two parameters. The first is the type of event, so this will be a click event, and then the second is a callback function. I'm going to put in an arrow function that's at ES6 JavaScript feature, and then I'm just going to make sure that everything's working first. We're going to console log button clicked, and let's just make sure that the JavaScript is working. Refresh, show the console. When I click, it should say over here button clicked, and it does. Very cool. Okay, so now what we got to do is we've got to figure out what we're going to do with this div. And so I've already got the div selected. So now what I'm going to say is on button click slide div, and I'm going to say dot style. So I'm accessing the style property on the element. And then what I want to change is the left property. So I'm saying slide div dot style dot left equals 50%. This is going to get us pretty close to what we want. By the way, this value does have to be wrapped in quotes for it to work. All right, so this is going to get us close to what we want, but you're going to see that's not exactly what we're looking for. So refresh, click the button, and that div didn't really slide at all. It just kind of showed up right away. I'm refreshing to make it go away right now because I haven't added the JavaScript to make it go away other than just refreshing. So we want to get rid of that so that it slides in. Let me first, though, add some sort of a button to make that go away. So I'm going to just add a span here. And it's just going to be an X. It's just going to look like one of those X buttons you see to exit out of something. So span X. Let's go ahead and put an ID on this. That would be more of a real world application. So we're going to say, let's call this exit button. All right, so I need to grab that as well. And so we're going to say let exit button equal document dot query selector, and then the ID is exit button. All right, so now you get to see an example of grabbing an element by the tag name, by the class name, or by the ID. All right, so those are the three examples. You could just as easily do document.getElement by ID in this case, but I like query selector. It's really easy, kind of all-encompassing, just really easy to grab things off the page. So now we need to add a very similar event listener here, and so we're going to say exit button dot add event listener, pass in the event type of click, throw in a callback function, and then we're going to say slide div dot style dot left, and we're going to set this equal to 100%. All right. And so what that's going to do is it's going to push it all the way back to its original value. Now, before we get too far into this, we're actually not going to see this X show up. It's going to be there, but we won't see it yet. And so the reason for that is it actually is there. It's probably somewhere. Well, I can see it right there with my cursor. If I click this, it's going to go away. But obviously we can't see the X. And the reason for that is because it's got the same color as the background. So we're going to go and change the color here, and that's going to say white. So let's go ahead and fix that, refresh, click, and there's the X right there. Obviously we could give this some styling, we can make it look prettier, we could put an icon here instead of the letter X, but you get the idea. I'm going to give this a little bit of styling. If you notice when I hover over this, it operates just like text. It doesn't actually operate like a button. So that's pretty easy to do. We're just going to give it a little bit of CSS. Let's go, so that's the ID of exit button, and we're going to say, let's go ahead and make it sans serif so that it does look a little bit more like an icon and less like text. Okay, so what that's going to do is it's going to get rid of the little like kind of tails that are sticking off the edges, and so we've got that. Let's go ahead and make it bold. And we're also going to add a little bit of a hover effect going on to the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a cursor of pointer, and then I'm going to say on hover, let's make it, I don't know, yellow. Let's give that a shot and kind of see what that looks like. Alright, so that definitely looks a lot more like a button. You see the little hands show up, and it changes colors too. This may not be the best color you would want. It's definitely not subtle, but you get the idea. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get this to actually slide in and off the page. Alright, this is very instant. This doesn't give a very good user experience. So that is just a little bit of CSS, just one line of CSS. So on that slide div, we just give it a transition property, and then what we pass into it is a time. And so I'm going to say 1,000 milliseconds, the same as 1 second. So that should make the div take 1 second to slide in. So let's take a look at that. And there you have it. So that's a lot, definitely a lot smoother. It definitely gives it the effect of sliding onto the page. You could, of course, mess with the timing of that however you want. If you want it to be faster or slower, all you'd have to do is change the value here. All right. You could also pass in seconds instead of milliseconds if you wanted to. You could do 1 second, or you could do a decimal value of a second. That's fine too. So it doesn't have to be milliseconds. Milliseconds are pretty standard though, as far as a unit of time in code. So there are some things that have to take milliseconds. All right, so let's give this a little bit of text. We're just about done here. It's definitely operating the way it should. So we're just going to give this some lorem ipsum. Let me just kind of copy and paste this a few times because I want to show you guys the position fixed thing that's going on here. So we'll have that. Let's put this same text in here a couple times. All right, so let's take a look at what we've got now. So we've got some text. If you notice, that doesn't look very good right there, right? And so what we can do is we can give this div right here the position of fixed, and that's going to allow it to stay right there whenever we scroll. Okay, so we'll go over to the right div, give it a position of fixed, and I want you to watch what's going to happen here. All of a sudden, now this div is not where we want it, nor can we really scroll. We kind of can, but it doesn't seem like we can. And so what's actually happening here, when I gave it this fixed property, because I didn't specify its top value or left value, it just went ahead and pushed it all the way to the left. Essentially, the top value and the left value by default became 0. So now, under this position fix, I'm going to give it a left property of 50%, and that's going to put it back where we want it. So when I refresh, there it is. All right, so we're back to where we were. Now watch what happens when I scroll here. I can scroll, and this stays still. And so this gives us more the effect that was asked of me in this challenge. Okay. You might also be wondering, how can we get this button to come up into this area so that this text is aligned with this text? So that's not too difficult to do. Because we have this fixed position property on this div, that's going to allow us to put an absolute position on this button and then very easily position it inside this div. The parent element of anything that is going to have a fixed or absolute position, if you want to have really good amount of control over placing that element, it's best for the parent element to have something like fixed or relative positioning to better place that. So we're going to take that button, and I don't think I have it in my CSS yet. We'll just go down here. All right, so button, we're going to say position, and we're going to say absolute. And just for now, let's give it a top 0 and left 0. So you can kind of see where that's going to put it. And that puts it right up there. And by doing that, by giving this an absolute position, now this text disregards this element. I'll show you what I mean. I could go in and put this at, say, 50 pixels and 50 pixels. And that should, because my padding, what's my padding? My padding is only 30 pixels, so that should actually make it show up right around here on top of the text, maybe over the word magna or something. Let's see what happens. Yeah, okay, so right above the word magna. It shows up right there. So that's what I mean by this text is completely disregarding the placement of this button. And so that's why we're able to very easily line up the text here. But if I didn't have position fixed on this element, then this button would actually be way over here, which is obviously not where we want it. So now let's actually find a good location for this button. I'm going to guess that probably 20 pixels. You know what, since we've got a padding of 15 pixels, let's just go kind of right in the middle of that. We'll say 15 pixels for each. So let's see what that looks like. Cool, that'll work. And then we're going to want to do the same for this button. Let's go ahead and give this slide div some text. Just a little bit of lorem ipsum. I think I've still got it in my clipboard. Cool. Okay, and we should have a color of white still on this div. I think I've applied that to the whole div, not just the span. Let's see. Awesome. Okay, so now we've got the same issue, and so we're going to solve it the same way. If you remember, this element already has a position of fix, so that we could still get the same scrolling effect. So this element right here has a position of fix, so we can take the same approach with that. And so we're gonna say on this span button, we're gonna give it a position of absolute, and we're gonna say top is 15 pixels and left is 15 pixels. Let's see what that looks like. Refresh. And there you have it. So that's the gist of it. That's a slide toggle without jQuery. If you look at the code, it's not a ton of code. I would say the bulk of the code is actually in the CSS. But some of this code is stuff you would have to do anyway, even if you were using jQuery. Obviously, setting up these divs side by side, that kind of stuff, you're still going to have to do even if you're using jQuery. Things like the transition time, that would be taken care of in that slide toggle method in jQuery, but a lot of the CSS would be here anyway. It's only 11 lines of code of JavaScript, and really, because we're using arrow functions, we can actually clean this up a little bit more. We could get rid of this, and tell you what, I'm going to close out this HTML document so we've got a little bit more screen real estate here. So check this out. We could even do it this way, where we put it all on one line, get rid of these curly braces. Now it's 7 lines of code, and it still works just the same. So in 7 lines of code, or if you want to really get picky, you could call it 5. 5 lines of code, that just kept us from having to import an entire library of jQuery. I'm totally a fan of that. I don't know about you, but this seems like a much easier, more performant solution. So thanks for watching.